Most people think this story is about a trade dispute. They think it's about tariffs, posturing, and another loud confrontation between Donald Trump and Canada. That's what the headlines say. That's what the clips show. But that version is shallow. What's really happening is far more revealing and far more dangerous. This is the moment when a political strategy built entirely on pressure finally collided with a system that refused to flinch. And when that happened, the illusion cracked. Because intimidation only works when everyone else believes you, willing and able to control the consequences. This time, that belief collapsed. On the surface, the story looked theatrical. A returning president suddenly declared that a trade agreement he once celebrated was now unacceptable. He raised tariffs as a threat. He framed cooperation as weakness. The assumption inside Washington was obvious. Canada would panic. Canada would blink. Canada would accept worse terms because that is what smaller partners are expected to do when power leans on them. But Canada didn't panic. It didn't escalate. It didn't perform outrage for cameras. Instead, it did something far more destabilizing for a pressure-based strategy. It stayed calm. It responded with documents, legal positioning, supply chain math, and quiet preparation. And in doing so, it exposed something deeply uncomfortable about how power is being exercised in the United States right now. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't improvisation. It was a calculated gamble based on a very specific worldview, one that treats agreements as temporary, allies as leverage, and rules as optional. A worldview that assumes fear will always do the work. That assumption failed. Officially, the administration signaled readiness to impose broad tariffs on Canadian goods, including materials woven directly into American manufacturing. The justification shifted constantly. Trade deficits, national security, fairness, whatever fit the moment. The legal rationale stretched. The rhetoric hardened. The expectation remained the same. Pressure first, negotiation later. But that's not how integrated economies work. North America is not a set of isolated national markets. It's a single production system built over decades. Parts cross borders multiple times before becoming finished products. Energy flows follow geography, not slogans. Jobs on one side of the border depend on stability on the other. When you threaten that system, you don't apply pressure outward. You pull threads that run straight through your own economy. This is where the miscalculation became fatal. The strategy assumed disruption itself would force compliance. But fear only works when the threat appears rational and controlled. Canada didn't see that. What it saw was a partner willing to violate its own frameworks for short-term political theater. So it adjusted accordingly. Instead of reacting emotionally, Canada mapped retaliation mathematically. Which industries would feel it first? Which regions would absorb the shock? Which voters would notice? That wasn't weakness. That was leverage applied without noise. And suddenly, the performance lost its power. Because once the other side refuses to play the victim, dominance becomes fragile. The strong man is left with only two options: escalate into real economic damage or retreat and pretend it was all misunderstanding. Neither option preserves the image that was promised. That's why this moment matters. Not because of lumber or dairy quotas, but because it reveals how brittle power becomes when it's divorced from institutions, predictability, and mutual dependence. When intimidation replaces structure, the system eventually pushes back. And when it does, the costs don't land on press secretaries or negotiators. They land on factories, households, and workers long before they reach the people who made the threats. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a messaging failure. It was the logical outcome of a worldview that mistakes noise for strength. And to understand why it failed so visibly, you have to understand how trade power actually works in the modern economy, not how it sounds in campaign speeches. Trade is not a scoreboard where one country wins and another loses. It is a web of dependencies that rewards predictability and punishes volatility. The United States understood this after World War II. That's why it helped design a system built on rules, institutions, and long-term trust. Stability creates growth. Growth creates legitimacy. What changed wasn't the system. It was the attitude toward it. The public justification for the pressure campaign leaned heavily on grievance. We were told previous agreements were unfair, that Canada was exploiting American generosity, that toughness had been missing. But those claims ignore why these agreements existed in the first place. They weren't charity. They were negotiated because they reduced costs, stabilized supply chains, and allowed businesses to plan years ahead. That's the unglamorous truth of trade policy. It works best when nobody is talking about it. What was missing from the public narrative was a serious accounting of who would absorb the shock. When tariffs hit integrated supply chains, companies don't reorganize overnight. They pause hiring. They freeze investment. They cut shifts. Then they pass costs down the line. That doesn't show up during press conferences, but it shows up quickly in grocery stores, housing prices, and paychecks. Business leaders understood this immediately. That's why panic appeared in boardrooms long before it appeared in speeches. Canada's response forced these mechanics into the open. By calmly outlining retaliation designed to mirror American political geography, it made something clear. This wasn't emotional. It was arithmetic. If parts stop moving, factories stop running. If energy flows tighten, prices rise. If farmers lose their nearest export market, incomes fall. No malice required. That's simply how the system functions. This is also where the myth of tariffs collapses. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They're paid by domestic importers. Those costs ripple outward through prices, wages, and investment. Economists have known this for decades. Politicians avoid saying it because it ruins the story. But reality doesn't care about the story. Industries dependent on cross-border inputs began warning of shutdowns. Energy markets reacted instantly. Construction costs climbed as materials became more expensive. This wasn't theory. It was feedback. Fast, mechanical, indifferent to slogans. Here's where power inverts. Real power in an integrated system doesn't come from fear. It comes from trust, from predictability, from honoring commitments even when it's inconvenient. When you abandon that, you don't become intimidating. You become risky. And risk is something markets, investors, and allies are trained to avoid. The deeper failure wasn't tactical, it was conceptual. Trade was treated like a personal contest instead of shared infrastructure. Pressure was expected to replace process, but process is what allows millions of people who never meet to cooperate across borders every day. Undermine that, and you're not renegotiating, you're destabilizing. And instability doesn't stay abstract. It settles into everyday life. Delayed construction, higher utility bills, fewer overtime hours. A sense that the ground is shifting, even if people can't name the policy responsible. That's the cost of governing by impulse instead of structure. And the resistance didn't come from outrage. It came from competence, from preparation, from refusing to abandon rules simply because someone demanded it. Systems don't collapse because someone yells loudly. They collapse when belief erodes. This time, belief held, and the gamble failed. This confrontation didn't just threaten profits, it threatened precedent. Once treaties can be brushed aside whenever they become inconvenient, every long-term agreement becomes suspect. Investors begin questioning whether promises made today survive tomorrow's mood. Companies reconsider whether building supply chains anchored in the United States is safe. That kind of uncertainty is poison to long-range planning. That's why opposition formed so quickly and so unusually. Business groups, industry associations, legal conservatives, not out of altruism, but self-preservation. If executive power can redefine an ally as a security threat without evidence, the entire framework limiting presidential authority begins to wobble. That's the real fight. Emergency economic powers were designed for extraordinary threats. Using them to settle policy disputes with allies doesn't just stretch the law, it reshapes it. Power shifts away from Congress and toward one individual. Courts understand this. That's why skepticism has been immediate and sharp. The more security is invoked without substance, the clearer the motive becomes: control. At the same time, political consequences are surfacing in ways that rhetoric can't hide. Rising prices are immediate. Manufacturing towns know how fragile supply chains are. Farmers know how fast markets disappear. These are the very communities promised protection. That's the irony. A strategy sold as defending ordinary Americans makes their lives more precarious. Inside the governing coalition, a quiet panic is forming. Voters tolerate a lot. They don't tolerate chaos that empties their wallets. Stability matters, especially in suburban districts allergic to unpredictability. A trade war with the country next door doesn't look strong. It looks reckless. Meanwhile, the most extreme voices demand escalation regardless of cost. Destruction becomes proof of authenticity. If institutions break, they were corrupt. If allies walk away, it's purification. That logic holds only until consequences arrive. Then the bill comes due. Canada's role here is almost incidental. This could have been any partner that refused to comply. The lesson would be the same. When rules are applied selectively, the fastest way to expose the lie is to insist on following them calmly and relentlessly. That doesn't generate spectacle. It changes outcomes. The deeper question is about restraint. Democracies aren't strong because leaders act without limits. They're strong because leaders are bound by them. When those limits are tested and defended, resilience is proven. When they're ignored and normalized, rot sets in quietly. What makes this moment dangerous is how quickly abnormal behavior is framed as normal governance. Threats replace negotiation. Emergency powers replace legislation. The public is trained to accept a permanent state of exception. That's how systems erode, not in a collapse, but through repetition. The real danger isn't one confrontation, it's habituation. Governance by brinkmanship. Every crisis becomes an excuse to escalate. Every institution becomes a target. Stability stops being the goal. Survival takes its place. So the question isn't whether you support one leader or another. It's whether you recognize the system being reshaped in real time. Whether you see how economic policy, legal authority, and political theater are being fused into something volatile. And whether you're willing to accept that as normal, or insist that limits still matter. Because consequences can be delayed. They can be denied, but they cannot be avoided. And when they arrive, they don't ask who was loudest. They ask who was competent.